Beautiful day. And I'm actually going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects in the entire planet today. So it's extra special. It's extra special. I feel winning and victory in World War III ending today. I feel it today in particular. Because South Korea, a place that I spent a lot of time in my life, had an election yesterday. They might have exited the clown world. They might have exited the clown world. They might be in a brand new clown world. We're not exactly sure. No one knows anything anymore. The world is crazy. We're not going to be talking about Ukraine and Russia today because what else is there to say? Who knows what's going on there still? So today we're going to be focused on a completely different part of the world, but I think with some really positive news for Bitcoiners. So on this show, we try to compare the fiat world with the Bitcoin world, the fiat standard with the Bitcoin standard, fiat institutions with burgeoning Bitcoin institutions. And the election that we saw yesterday in Korea actually pitted crypto against fiat institutions as one of the main election topics. Crypto itself was inside most of the debates, generational debates, wealth transfer debates, the demographic debates, and we're going to get into each of those things. Now, let me just, I guess, first say Yoon Suk Yeol is the winner. He became the new prime minister, and brand new party. This party came out of nowhere, and the people in the party themselves didn't come out of nowhere. But there's a bunch of pieces to it that really, I think, maybe signal some big things for Bitcoin, for America, for everything we're seeing right now. So first, let me just give you a bit of a background on my own personal experience in Korea, just so you know where I'm coming from, and maybe understand that I do have a bit of analysis or a bit of insight on what's going on in Korea. So I lived there as an English teacher between my undergrad and law school, and got to learn the language a little bit. I can read and write. That's Yoon Suk Yeol. I can get around. It's not great. I probably have 200 words vocabulary. I can order food. Banchan mane juseyo. That's give me a lot of the nice little side dishes that you get at the Korean restaurants, right? You say that when you get into the restaurant. Give me a lot of those beautiful, delicious dishes. We're going to talk about the manners in a second because it's a big part of actually what's going on in Korea. A country like Korea, and we're going to talk about it here in this tradition versus modernism, kind of scaled really quickly as a country. They became urban, and Seoul grew out of nothing within 10, 20 years after the Korean War. And the language itself, the Korean language itself, is a little onerous when you're speaking with older people or people you know or friends and all these kinds of things. The articles that you would put in them, like in English, we have Mr., Miss, Mrs., it's pretty simple. In their language, they've got a lot more of these things, and they actually end up changing the entire sentence, a lot like a verb would in English. I will go there, I went there. The verb is really the dynamic piece. Often in the Korean language, who you're speaking to can affect how the sentence is structured. So all that to say, it's not that easy to scale friendships and relationships from a country setting where you can take more time into the modern world. And it was one of the reasons why Seoul itself was not a very polite place over the years when I was there, in the sense that people were a bit like New York City. No one cared. You'd get cut off. They'd run around. No one spoke to people, kind of rude stuff. But that's just because this whole, at least that was my theory having been there, that this entire onerous, difficult language piece, like when a young person smokes a cigarette with an older person at a bar there, for example, the young person will actually hide their inhales like this, just to be like, I know I'm young and I should be working to support you who did so much in your life to make the country great. I shouldn't really be taking this minute off. I should hide myself. You're definitely allowed to sit there and drink, but it's just sort of a way to show respect and all that stuff. When someone hands you change, they'll touch their arm in a position that indicates your social status. Very Confucian. They say it's the most Confucian country left in the world. And that just doesn't scale into an urban environment. So that has a lot to do with some of the tensions that were there. So I stayed in Korea between my undergrad and law school. I went back after I graduated from law school and worked as a lawyer there, and stayed in all kinds of really neat areas and in the city of Seoul, and got to know the place really well. Years later, when I was working with CoinDesk when it first came to America, I helped set up the Korean version of CoinDesk, CoinDesk Korea, and found the partner, which is called Hankyoreh, which was a news site that's a little bit like The Economist, sort of like a soft center left, but not extreme. It seemed like a good partner at the time, and I ended up using them. Oh, what's going on? I got to
Reshift your camera just for a brief second. A
Yep.
little bit more. A little
Yep.
more. Yep. Perfect. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you. Keep going.
No soda. So these. So what was I saying about Korea? 1 second. It was about changing, going from law school. It's okay. It was about going from law. I went to law school. I went to law school, and then I came, worked there, got to know some really neat people.
You started Korean CoinDesk.
Korean CoinDesk. Yeah, sorry, I was a little ahead. Yeah, started Korean CoinDesk. So I used Hankyoreh, which is kind of like The Economist, and it's still a very successful news operation and going really well. So let's talk about Yoon Suk Yeol and why this is really different, and what's going on over there. So first of all, it looked like a two candidates. So it's that crypto was an agreed upon center in this election. Both candidates, their left-wing candidate and their right-wing candidate, both agreed that legacy financial system wasn't working for Korea. Korea has tremendous credit card debt, tremendous personal debt. People are really leveraged hard there. It's been a Cantillon nightmare there for some people because this country has actively, when I lived there, I've mentioned on this show before, I got to understand FX markets a lot in that decade because I was earning their local money and everybody in the country knew it was devalued. Trump, in his campaign, threatened to make Korea a currency manipulator in the world scene, which would, have all kinds of implications for how they extended credit abroad and all these kinds of things. So Korea has been a major buyer of American T-bills debt for a long time in order to maintain its trade imbalance in the United States and continue to sell all those Hyundais. Weirdly, when I grew up in Quebec, Hyundai, this is another amazing connection that I've had with this country. Hyundai built cars in Canada when I was a child, and weirdly, my whole village on the border of Vermont and Quebec just got filled with Korean kids when I was a little kid. And weirdly, also, they got exempt from the language laws. They shouldn't have even been allowed to go to school with me because I was at an English school, but they were allowed. So I had a ton of these Korean friends as a kid. And it happened in the same year that Canada hosted the Olympics and Korea hosted the Olympics. So I had this sort of strange, like Canada, Korea, everything in the world, everyone talking about it. All of a sudden, my town is filled with Korean. So I sort of never forgot about it. That's why it was easy for me to move there years later. So this sort of goes way back to childhood and then continued straight up until I was a professional setting up CoinDesk career there. And I went back sort of every year in the past years until COVID, check in on the business, see what's going on, meet people, check out the Bitcoin scene over there and talk about stuff. So back to this currency manipulation thing. Trump threatened to do it. They've been dealing with local capital controls for a long time. There is like a $50,000 limit. I think it's around that. It was $50,000 US when I was there per year that they were allowed to exit. They had trouble paying tuition when they would come to school in America because usually American tuitions are a little higher than their capital controls allow them. So they have these they're allowed to do it. So everyone got used to this FX hedging. But this is the interesting part, is they are so used to FX hedging, they're so used to this debate that what I saw between the left and the right, that both agreed crypto versus the legacy system, internally had the debates that we would recognize in crypto versus Bitcoin, where this fellow, the conservative guy, did see Bitcoin as separate from the rest of the market and had a bit more attention on it. Now, I'm not going to say he's a Bitcoiner. I'm not going to paint a picture that it's exactly like what someone from Bitcoin Magazine would have wanted to see, but there was definitely an appreciation for the macro aspect versus the more left-wing party that I would say was really interested in the creative economy side, really interested in the social incentivization sort of side. So a little more on the games and training people to do things side. So, teach their own. I don't think the left, it was a very tight election too. So I also don't want to paint a picture that this guy wiped him out or anything. Very tight, but it looks like as far as Bitcoiners are concerned, it sort of went the Bitcoiner way with this guy. He's a big libertarian, and this is where it gets funny. He cites Milton Friedman all the time, won't take a conservative label or a populist label, but he promised to get rid of the minimum wage. So they're not going to have a minimum wage anymore. He's going to get rid of any food safety standards using a Milton Friedman argument that poor people should have the choice to eat, undervalued or cheap food if they want. His argument being that the market will supply answers, and that already, if you know Korea, you'll see that there's tremendous competition for street food, and no idiot would eat at a dirty Korean street food place anyway, because there's so many good ones. Why would you go to the dirty one with no people when you can go to the nice one with a lot of people? I never checked a license in my whole life, and I lived off of street food in Korea. So maybe it made a difference. I don't know. My bet is not. And he's now going to at least explore Korean street food without any licensing and all this stuff. And my prediction right there is you're going to see a proliferation of a new business model around food. Korea already has that model where they'll deliver real dishes to your house for takeout. They're way ahead of Uber and all that stuff, Uber Eats that we would use in America. They bring the actual hot dishes for sushi and for whatever, and they come back and pick them up at night. So they're going to be able to add a whole new, maybe selling out of individual kitchens and stuff like that. So, and it looks like young men in particular moved to the party. So brand new party, People's Power Party. Of 20-year-old males, they got 55.3% of the vote versus 34.1%. So we see this turn now where the boomer generation and the older generation are the liberals, and the younger males in particular, females were sort of split, but definitely not one-sided as you might imagine it to be in America or Europe. The males went heavily towards this conservative option or libertarian option. Males in their 30s, even more so. It was 56% and a little more for the left-wing guys. This one's going to sound unbelievable to most Americans. So they're going to abolish the Ministry of Women and gender equality. And he ran on a campaign in response to Me Too of me first. That's what they went with, me first. I can't think of a more incendiary thing. I mean, I can't think of a more incendiary response to Me Too. Now, look, I've seen a lot of what Westerners would describe as absolutely horrific. Horrific would be strong. Westerners have seen gender imbalance there that insults them. I've seen some stuff there too that I'm definitely not okay with. And I've seen in particular violence against women firsthand. There's even a culture of paying for a lot of sexual experiences, let's say. And that is something that really was uncomfortable for me as a young guy there. But I learned to not really compare their lifestyle with my own. I grew up in a Canadian high school, and basically all I did in high school was learn how to talk to girls. I mean, that's all we did. I don't think we did anything else. I didn't study. No one did. Who did that, right? You learned how to interact with people of the other gender, with your own friends. There's not a lot of pressure. No people in our generation, and this is what I realized when I was there, that no people in our generation there are some, but it's not a standard thing where we've got to take care of our parents. There's no young man who, like me, didn't really have to take high school seriously, doesn't have the pressure of taking care of my parents. There's no social safety net for Social Security for retired people in Korea. It's not like it is in America. So that generation had to be taken care of by the young generation. So when these young males would do that, and I always looked down on it and said, it is terrible. I'm not saying any of this stuff is good, but I did learn to not judge them by my own standards and say, well, look, they have a totally different life than me, and it's not the same thing. Now, I don't think I'm going to mind read this new leader. I don't think he actually is against any form of gender equality in the sense that Me Too is trying to stop crimes. This guy is a prosecutor. I'm going to say that it was more about getting the reaction. It's like that whole thing where you're asked in a political campaign, when are you going to stop beating your dog? But why does this guy, why does he have to answer in the affirmative or negative to a question that isn't really about that? He's concerned about the birth rate in Korea. And I think a lot of people are. Korea has a terrible birth rate. So that's really what the question was about, this birth rate, gender balance, working women, not working women, how many ways are there to increase the birth rate? So in his mind, he had really, I think, existential problems with the country and its future, and didn't want to get bogged down in some of the gender politics. You can say it's right or wrong, and maybe they might need more debate around this stuff. What he's saying is, forget it, we're not doing that. We have more immediate things to solve. So that's what happened. And it's a big change. I mean, if you're running on a campaign of me first versus Me Too, you're seeing that there's a major change in dialogue and the way this stuff is being debated. And if you compare that even to America now, we've got that omnibus bill that came with a $1.5 trillion just 2 nights ago, barely read, but skimming through it, Oilfield Rando pointed out that it's got $200 million for gender equity and the Equity Action Fund. So they're going to give money to investors to do gender equity stuff as a fund. They've got $50 million to the Women's Leadership Fund. So I guess if they find 50 women leaders, do they pay them $1 million to be leaders? What's going on? What's the $50 million for? How many people do they have to pay to be leaders? A lot of money. So, and no one's ever going to debate about it. So when I see this debate that we can see in Korea, they've clearly got a Bitcoin versus fiat debate. They've got a young and old debate generationally, but it's kind of flipped around. It's not the conservative is old, the liberals are young. They flipped it already. It already did the flip. And then the young people are actually the traditionalists. So I lived in a neighborhood in South Korea for a little while called Jongno Samga. It's very traditional neighborhood, little streets, and just a gorgeous place. I went there first time when I was a teacher. This would have been around the World Cup time, 2002. And it was, really busy, urban. A lot of the old traditional stuff was being overwhelmed by hastily built stuff from the 1960s and 70s. I went back in 2008 when I was working as a young articling lawyer, and they had finally done one of their first public renovation projects to reestablish what had been a natural creek there in that whole area for hundreds of years. And they rebuilt it, and they had poured concrete and filled it. They filled a creek with concrete because it was expedient to put roads in and all that stuff. And there was this ditch with a beautiful creek running under it. That was traditionally one of the reasons why they had the city there in the first place. And now they had redone it, and they made this creek gorgeous. They've redone a lot of that neighborhood now. And you keep seeing all these different changes that they've done. And you see a country that quickly lost its traditional aspects by modernizing so quickly, but they still have a generation that remembered the traditional pieces. And now it looks like there's a revival movement amongst the young people to re-embrace the traditional things they've only heard about that were gone. And it looks like they're going for it. And even when you look at the way they did the election, some of the neat things that came out of it, they resurrected dead presidents. I mean, just think about it. We're talking about merging traditional cultures with modern stuff and this appetite for the things you didn't know about. They actually resurrected dead leaders using deepfake and AI. And they would interview in like a sports thing, like a telecast. They recreated old leaders, and television commentators would interview the old leaders. Like imagine we had like an AI of JFK. And JFK was like, well, what do you think about Trump? And then he's like, well, he does this and I wouldn't do that. And they had this stuff. That's what they did in their election. And first note on that, it reminds me that in this day and age, if you see a video and you're arguing and you're saying, oh, I saw the video myself, it's true. No, stop. You saw a video doesn't mean anything anymore. So get that out of your head. If we're going to talk about breakup on this show, break up with the idea that seeing a video means you saw something that happened for real. It did not happen. It didn't. It's just a video. It's a cartoon. They're all cartoons now. You can't tell the difference between a cartoon and reality. I can't tell the difference when I saw this guy. They resurrected dead presidents and they gave live interviews to real questions. And they sounded coherent. They really did. And what the whole picture kind of reminds me of, we've got all this crazy stuff in their election. Here on our end, we've got Dan Held reminding us that world reserve currencies are being challenged. We're at 20-year inflation highs. We've got huge BTC awareness, war and pandemic eroding trust in institutions. Another fella, Garrick Morin, tells us Canada freezing bank accounts, USA freezing international reserves, the London Mercantile Exchange canceling trades that hurts brokers. Things are moving fast and the rule of law is breaking down in the financial system. It's not good. When I look at these two things, this dynamic. Now, I don't want to paint a picture of the Korean election like everyone's happy about it. Everyone in that country believes it was their version of the Trump-Hillary thing. like, families broken apart, people fighting, people hating each other, really tense, really awful, everyone calling each other names. And then I look at the chaos that the legal system in America is in, and I look at the situation Korea finds itself in. They've already, let's say, strangled a bit of their crypto industry by going too hard on some regulations in the past couple of years. They've reduced the number of exchanges to very few compared to proliferation before. And I see the way they're maybe getting through some stuff and making a turn and changing. Some things negative, some things positive. But it reminds me of hybrid flowers a little bit. It reminds me of something I heard once about Ichiro Suzuki, the Japanese baseball player. Ichiro Suzuki played baseball the way baseball was played, the Shoeless Joe Jackson way, the Wee Willie Keeler way, the 1910s and 20s way, before Babe Ruth played baseball, before the home run, when it was all base stealing and small ball. That was the baseball that was actually exported for the first time to Japan. That was brought to Japan and was played there. This hat that I'm wearing here is actually an American all-star team from 1922 that traveled to Japan to play, and Babe Ruth was on the team and all these guys were on the team. And they went over there and they made baseball the biggest thing. And when Ichiro Suzuki played baseball in the 1990s and 2000s in America, this was in the era of the home run, the steroids, the Mark McGwire, the Sammy Sosa, and all these guys. And all of a sudden, this skinny kid came out, stealing bases, slapping the ball this way, slapping the ball that way, infield hits, all this old style baseball. And it reminded everyone of this beautiful game, the way it was played almost 100 years earlier and exported to Japan. So this is the hybrid flower theory. And you see it in colonial activity, colonial history quite a bit, where countries that took on qualities of the other country end up becoming more accentuated. They become more dramatic. And in a lot of ways, Korea is a super America. It's more American than America at times, a little bit like Japan can be with baseball. Both of these places have their own culture. So I don't want to make it sound like they absorbed all of American culture. But it was American imperialism kind of at its best. It's like, have the merchant in charge, have the rule of law, have good markets. You're on your own, wear your own clothes, do whatever you want. We don't care. You're just going to have this constitution that makes sure the rule of law and the merchant is in charge. Whatever else happens, you're on your own. And in the end, we see that there are systems based entirely on American systems from the end of World War II. And in some ways, Korea is sort of the very end of World War II / beginning of the Cold War. And in some ways, it's coming right around full circle. We see Korea becoming one of the most amazing democracies on earth now. I mean, that was an amazing election to have gone through, to witness and to see what happens. I was there for the election in 2002 when a local guy, Nyo Moo-yeon, when I was staying in this town called Busan, was elected. I was there again when I was on that time as a lawyer in 2008, and he killed himself when I was in town. The simulation delivered me into a strange circumstance. He was elected in 2002 when I was there, the biggest news in the country, biggest, local boy, hero, poor kid, lawyer, super liberal. He was like, all the dreams that Obama got caught up in America. It was kind of similar, right? Homogenous ethnically for that country, but he was from like sort of a poor background, worked really hard and made it. But corruption, all that other stuff. And by the time I went back, it was over. And I mean, literally the day I came back, I hadn't been there in years. And I came back and it's front page news, he was gone. And so now we see that they have this tense election, and it looks like they've gotten over some of these problems. It looks like they've matured. They've matured from the state they were in the 1980s, the 90s, and now today. And in some ways, it is this kind of hybrid flower situation where all of the things they're doing looks like they're creating what will be a safe haven for Bitcoiners in the future. This is a country that is on the side of people looking to mitigate the trouble of central banking and central planning, and is willing to say the things that maybe not everyone agrees with, but that at least will help change things. So my example of a country maybe getting over the hump first, maybe getting through World War III first, maybe it's just getting worse. We don't know. But in my worldview, these guys are a little ahead right now. Maybe not in the ways everyone can see, but in the ways that are going to be helpful, I think, especially if you believe this sort of hybrid flower theory, because I think a lot what's going on in Korea can actually come to America later. And it might be them who bails us out. World War III might end totally different than World War II. It might be Latin Americans who don't have their central banks, Koreans who don't have their central banks, Africans who don't have their central banks coming to bail us Americans out. Not me, but other people. So there you go. That's the episode of The Breakup today. Deha Mingu.